At the close of the 8th century, the world was old. It was a world of weary empires and fledgling barbarian kingdoms built upon the ruins of what was once Rome. The map was a tapestry woven from 3 primary threads. To the south and east stretched the golden silk of the Abbasid Caliphate, the planet's intellectual and commercial heart. Its wisdom was immeasurable, its wealth legendary. In the center, clutching at its fraying seams, was the crimson of the Byzantine Empire, the ghost of Rome, obsessed with its past and paranoid about its future. Its navy owned the Mediterranean, its intrigues owned the continent's politics. And in the west, awkward and sprawling, lay the Carolingian Empire, a patchwork quilt of conquered tribes stitched together by the will of one man, Charlemagne. It was a world of land, not water. Wealth was measured in acres, power by the number of swords a feudal lord could muster. The ocean was a boundary, the edge of the map, inhabited only by monsters and madness. All of them, the Caliph in Baghdad, the Emperor in Constantinople, and the Kaiser in Aachen, watched one another, playing the great game of thrones. They were the predators of their known world. They did not look north. Why would they? The north was nothing. A cold, wet, impoverished land inhabited by savages. Scandinavia was a footnote in the margins of the grand historical narrative, a place with no gold, no cities, no God. It was a geopolitical blind spot. And it was in this blind spot, in the quiet of the icy fjords, that a cataclysm was breeding. The spark that lit the fuse was not a letter or a line on a map. It was the curve of a tree. The perfect bend of an oaken plank. For hundreds of years, the northern peoples had built boats, but they were clumsy, coastal vessels. And then, through generations of trial and error, they made a breakthrough. The technology of clinker-built hulls, where the planks overlapped, created a frame that was both flexible and incredibly strong. They perfected the keel, forging a spine that could withstand the fury of the North Atlantic. And they raised a sail. The result was a technological marvel, a masterpiece of minimalist and lethal design. The Drakkar. This was not merely a ship. It was an ultimatum delivered to geography itself. Long, narrow, with a terrifyingly shallow draft, it could cross the open ocean and then, without breaking stride, enter the mouth of any river and glide for dozens of miles into the heart of enemy territory, to places where no one had ever expected an attack from the water. It was both a sea monster and a river serpent. It gave its masters absolute, unthinkable mobility. It turned every river in England, France, and Russia into an invasion highway. It rendered every coastline defenseless. The Drakkar was the key that could unlock any door in Europe. And the men who built it were hungry. The conflict of interest was existential. The world of the Carolingians and Byzantines was static. Its wealth was concentrated in monasteries and cities, protected by walls against threats from the land. Their armies were slow-moving infantry levies. Their mindset was terrestrial. The Vikings were their polar opposite. Their society was dynamic, their wealth portable. Their strength was speed. They were a maritime power without a state, a corporation of raiders whose ships were simultaneously their transport, their home, and their weapon. They could not negotiate because they spoke different languages of power. For a Frankish count, value was land he could pass to his heirs. For a Scandinavian jarl, value was silver he could put in a sack and carry away to buy prestige and hire more warriors for new raids. It was a clash between a civilization of accumulation and a culture of extraction. The summer of 793. On the holy island of Lindisfarne, off the coast of Northumbria, the monks were at prayer. Their monastery was one of the richest in the Christian world, a treasury filled with golden crosses and illuminated manuscripts. They were defenseless because they were protected by God Himself. They looked out at the calm sea and saw no threat. And then, shadows appeared on the horizon. Long, low silhouettes with curved prows crowned with the heads of dragons. They moved silently and with unnatural speed. Before the bells could be rung in alarm, the keels of the ships were already grating on the sand. The monks went out to meet them, expecting merchants or pilgrims. It was a mistake. Tall, fair-haired men flooded the shore. In their hands were axes. On their faces was neither fear nor reverence. They did not see the sanctity of the place. They saw only assets, ready for liquidation. This was not a battle. It was a slaughter. The first act of aggression was not a declaration of war. It was the opening of a brutal new market. And the price of entry was written in blood on the altar of Lindisfarne. The world heard the screams, but it did not understand their meaning. It decided they were merely pirates. It did not yet know that these were auditors, who had come to tally its wealth. The news from Lindisfarne spread through the Christian world like a plague. Letters filled with horror flew from monastery to monastery, from bishop to king. But the reaction was slow, steeped in bafflement and hubris. Who were these heathens? Where did they come from? The court scholars of Charlemagne described them as a divine punishment for sins, a temporary affliction, savages who could be driven off or converted to the true faith. An empire capable of fielding tens of thousands of heavy cavalry did not see an existential threat in a few boatloads of brigands. This was a fundamental error of perception. They were preparing for a war, while the Vikings were conducting business. And business was booming. The conflict escalated with the efficiency of a wildfire. Every year, with the coming of spring, the fleet of dragon ships grew. What began as isolated raids metastasized into a systematic exsanguination of Europe's arteries. They did not just pillage. They operated with a cold, entrepreneurial logic. Why assault a massive, fortified city when you could burn a dozen defenseless monasteries and villages along a river, collect the silver, slaves, and grain, and be gone before the ponderous feudal army even deigned to assemble? They were masters of asymmetrical warfare. The map of Europe became their personal treasure map. Up the rivers Seine, Loire, Rhine, and Thames, their ships penetrated the very heart of the continent. They besieged Paris, Hamburg, Seville. They became a cataclysm, an annual natural disaster, as predictable as the changing of the seasons and just as unstoppable. The reaction of society was predictable. First came panic. Chroniclers wrote of dragons in the sky and rains of blood. The prayer, of Furor Normanorum libera nos, Domini, from the fury of the Northmen deliver us, O Lord, became part of the church service throughout Europe. Then came the nationalist fervor. Kings built forts, bridges, and chain booms on the rivers. Occasionally, they managed a victory, crushing a single Viking band. These victories were inflated into epic triumphs, proof of civilization's superiority over barbarism. But it was self-deception. By defeating one band, they were merely raising the insurance premiums for the next. The Vikings simply returned the following year, with a larger fleet and better intelligence. The key figures of the age, the rulers of Europe, were trapped by their own pride. They were products of their system. Charles the Bald in France, Alfred the Great in England, they were intelligent and capable leaders, but their tools were obsolete. They tried to counter this new, fluid, maritime enemy with the old, static, terrestrial power. They summoned their levies, but the Vikings had already sailed away. They built fortresses, but the Vikings simply bypassed them. Their greatest mistake was to underestimate their adversary. They saw mindless berserkers, drunk on bloodlust. They failed to see the calculating strategists, the brilliant seafarers, and, most importantly, the pragmatic merchants behind the facade. It was this pragmatism that led to the next stage of escalation. The Vikings realized they could acquire more silver without spilling blood. They shifted from raiding to issuing ultimatums. A jarl with his fleet anchored beneath a city's walls would offer a choice, the axe or the purse. Thus was born the concept of Danegeld, Dane money. It was racketeering on a national scale. Kings and bishops paid enormous ransoms to make the invaders leave. But they always returned for another installment. It was a humiliation that drained treasuries and eroded the very idea of kingship. A king who cannot protect his subjects is no king at all. The situation reached a boiling point. The Vikings changed their business model. Why sail home to cold Scandinavia for the winter when they could stay here, in the warm and wealthy lands? They began to seize islands at river mouths and establish fortified winter camps. They were no longer raiders. They had become occupiers. In England, entire kingdoms fell to their onslaught, forming the territory known as the Danelaw. In France, they seized the land at the mouth of the Seine that would one day become Normandy. They were no longer knocking on Europe's door. They had kicked it off its hinges and were making themselves comfortable in the living room. The world held its breath on the edge of a precipice. The old order was cracking. It became clear that the Northmen could not be expelled. The clock was ticking, counting down the last moments of the Europe that had existed before them. The question was no longer how to defeat them, but how to live with them. And the answer to that question would change everything. The moment of truth arrived not on a battlefield, but in the cold halls of castles and the smoky tents of chieftains. The rulers of Europe and the Viking lords, each in their own way, stared into the abyss and recognized the true cost of the conflict. For the kings of England and France, the price was measured in mountains of silver flowing out as Danegeld, in scorched lands, and in the humiliating inability to protect the church and the people. Their legitimacy, founded on divine right and military might, was becoming a fiction. For the Vikings, the cost was different. Success had bred new problems. Massive fleets required ever more men and resources. Competition among chieftains for the best lands and richest plunder grew fierce. Simple raiding was no longer yielding the same returns, there was little left to raid. They were sitting on a hoard of looted goods in the midst of the ruins they themselves had created. They were kings of ash. To preserve and grow their wealth, they needed stability. They needed infrastructure. They needed trade, not just war. The protagonists realized their business model, founded on destruction, had reached its limit. It was at this moment that an unexpected factor was introduced to the chessboard, changing the entire game. This factor was not a third power or a new weapon. It was an idea. The idea of assimilation. The rulers of Europe, despairing of defeating the Vikings by force, tried another tactic: bribery. Not with silver, but with something far more valuable: land and status. The most famous example is the King of West Francia, Charles the Simple. In 911, faced with an implacable Viking leader named Rollo who was relentlessly ravaging the Seine Valley, Charles made him an offer that was both brilliant and desperate. He offered Rollo the entire northern part of his kingdom, the future Normandy. But there were two conditions. Rollo had to accept Christianity and become Charles's vassal. His new job: to defend the kingdom from other Vikings. This was the turning point. Charles was transforming the most dangerous predator into his own guard dog. He could not eradicate the threat, so he legalized it. For Rollo, it was also a way out. Instead of risking everything each year in bloody raids, he would receive legal title to some of the richest lands in Europe. He was trading the status of a pirate for that of a duke. It was a deal he couldn't refuse. And Rollo accepted. The pagan chieftain knelt, was baptized, and became the first Duke of Normandy. The Vikings found themselves caught in a trap of their own ambition. The same story, with variations, repeated itself across Europe. In England, in the Danelaw, Scandinavian kings began to mint coins with Christian symbols to trade with their Anglo-Saxon neighbours. In Ireland, they founded cities, Dublin, Waterford, Limerick, that evolved from pirate bases into the region's largest commercial hubs. They were becoming sedentary. They married local women. Their children spoke the local languages, with an accent, but they spoke them. They built churches next to their pagan shrines. The most grandiose process of assimilation occurred in the East. Swedes, known there as the Russ or Varangians, traveled down the rivers deep into the vast Slavic lands. They came as mercenaries and traders, seeking not gold, but furs, honey, wax, and slaves to sell in the markets of Constantinople and Baghdad. But the vast distances and the need to control the trade routes forced them to stay. They seized power in local Slavic settlements, Novgorod, Kiev. And just like Rollo in France, their leader Rurik and his descendants transformed from heads of an armed corporation into a ruling dynasty. To govern a diverse population and to do business with the mighty Byzantine Empire, Prince Vladimir adopted Byzantine Christianity in 988. Yesterday's Varangians became the founders of the state that would go down in history as Kievan Rus. The abyss they had looked into was the abyss of obsolescence. To preserve their power and wealth, they had to renounce who they were. Their unique culture, their language, their religion, their very identity, all became commodities in a geopolitical transaction. The axe was effective for seizure, but the cross was required for governance. The drakkar was perfect for a raid, but a fortress was needed to collect taxes. They came as destroyers, but to hold what they had conquered, they had to become builders. And the moment the first Viking chieftain exchanged his wolfskin cloak for the brocaded mantle of a duke, their fate was sealed. They had won so much that they began to lose themselves. Who blinked first? In this great game, no one blinked. Instead, over several generations, one of the players slowly dissolved, merging with his opponent. The reckoning for the Vikings was not a defeat on the battlefield. It was the triumph of their own model. They had won so completely that their culture became redundant. The victors were not the old empires they had tormented, but the new world they had unwittingly created. A world in which their descendants became Frenchmen, Englishmen, and Russians. The humiliation of the vanquished was quiet and gradual. It was not recorded in any peace treaty. It could be read in the changing of names. The Scandinavian Hrolfr became the French Rollo, then the English Rollo. It could be heard in the language. 100 years after the founding of Normandy, the descendants of Rollo's Vikings spoke French and knew not a word of their ancestors' tongue. When William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy and a descendant of Rollo, invaded England in 1066, it is often called the last Viking invasion. But it was not. It was an invasion of French knights whose great-great-grandfathers had been Vikings. They fought not for Odin, but for the feudal rights granted to them by a Christian god. The triumph of the victor was the triumph of assimilation, of a more complex and resilient cultural and economic system. The Vikings were the catalyst, brutal but necessary. They had shattered the closed, claustrophobic economy of the early Middle Ages. With their ships, they had stitched trade routes across all of Europe like a needle and thread, connecting the Islamic world with the Baltic, Byzantium with the British Isles. They were the violent globalists of their age. They created a demand for silver, which led to the opening of new mines. They founded cities that became centers of craft and commerce. They forced European kings to create more effective systems of taxation and stronger armies to counter them, thereby pushing forward the process of state centralization. The irony was that modern Europe, with its nations, its trading leagues, and its dynamic economy, was born in the fire that they themselves had kindled. They were the midwives of a new world, a world that ultimately consumed them. Let us return to the image from the beginning. To the drakkar. In the 8th century, it was a symbol of terror and chaos, a predator emerging from the mist. By the 11th century, it had become an anachronism. New, larger, and more capacious ships designed to carry goods instead of warriors, cogs and nefs, pushed it from the trade routes. The longship, built for the raid and the retreat, proved inefficient in the world the Vikings themselves had forced to turn to trade and construction. The weapon that had given them hegemony became useless in the era it had spawned. Thus their age ended. Not with a thunderous defeat, but with a quiet exit from the stage. They were not exterminated. They simply changed their clothes. Their energy, their ambition, their drive, none of it disappeared. It was infused into the DNA of new nations. The Viking spirit lived on in the enterprise of Norman barons, in the courage of the Varangian Guard in Constantinople, in the adventurousness of the explorers who would one day cross the Atlantic, following their forgotten routes. They destroyed the myth of the horned helmets they never wore, but they created a far more complex and intriguing paradox. They were the brutal benefactors, the pirates who taught the world to trade. They came to plunder the world, but instead, they bought it. And they paid with themselves.